It was a typical Friday night at home. My wife, Laura, and I had just finished watching a movie with our two kids when we decided it was time to call it a night. The kids ran upstairs, already in their pajamas, and Laura and I cleaned up the living room, folding blankets and picking up empty bowls of popcorn. It was one of those nights that I cherished, quiet, calm, and predictable. The house we lived in was a bit isolated, sitting on a large plot of land surrounded by woods. It was one of the reasons we bought it in the first place. Privacy. We had no close neighbors, and the idea of being tucked away from the world was appealing. But on nights like this, when the house was dark and the wind whispered through the trees, that same isolation felt a little unnerving. After tucking the kids in and checking all the doors, I headed to bed, expecting nothing more than a quiet night's sleep. I had no idea the night was just getting started. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me from sleep, but as I lay there, listening to the soft sound of Laura's breathing beside me, I heard it, a faint tapping noise. I sat up in bed, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It was slow and rhythmic, like someone lightly tapping on glass. My heart rate picked up as I looked toward the window. It was dark outside, and the moonlight cast long shadows across the yard. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but the tapping continued, deliberate and constant. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, careful not to wake Laura. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and used its light to guide me down the hall. As I reached the top of the stairs, I paused, listening again. The sound was coming from the living room, from one of the large windows that overlooked the front yard. I took a deep breath and crept down the stairs. As I neared the living room, I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The house was silent except for that persistent tapping. When I reached the window, I saw it, a figure standing just outside, illuminated by the faint moonlight. The figure was barely visible, but they were there, their hand tapping slowly against the glass. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was just standing there, watching the house and tapping slowly against the glass. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the shadowy figure outside. It could have been seconds, but it felt like hours. I couldn't fully process what I was looking at. Who would be out here, in the middle of the night, tapping on our window? Suddenly, the figure stepped back, melting into the darkness of the yard. My heart raced as I pressed my face closer to the glass, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the empty yard and the dark outline of the trees beyond. I reached for the light switch and flicked it on, casting a warm glow across the living room. My eyes darted to the window again, but the figure was gone. I wanted to believe it was just a trick of my imagination, shadows playing with my mind, but deep down, I couldn't deny what I saw. Still shaken, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before heading back upstairs. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the unease followed me back to bed, and I spent the rest of the night lying awake, listening for any sound that might indicate the figure had returned. The next morning, I decided not to tell Laura about what I had seen. I didn't want to worry her, especially if it turned out to be nothing. But the unease stayed with me all day. I found myself looking out the windows more often than usual, expecting to see that shadowy figure standing in the yard again. And it wasn't until the following night that things escalated. We had just finished dinner, and the kids were upstairs getting ready for bed. Laura and I were sitting in the living room, catching up on a show, when it happened again. The tapping. This time, it wasn't faint or distant. It was louder, more insistent, coming from the window just a few feet away from where we were sitting. Laura turned to me, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Did you hear that?" she asked. I nodded, my pulse quickening. I motioned for Laura to stay where she was. As I approached the window, I shined the flashlight outside, sweeping it across the yard. And there it was again, the same figure, standing just beyond the reach of the light. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice stronger than I felt. The figure didn't respond. I took a step closer to the window, but the moment I did, the figure retreated into the darkness, disappearing among the trees. Laura joined me at the window, her face pale. "What's going on?" she whispered. "Why are they doing this?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaking. "But I'm calling the police." The police arrived about 20 minutes later, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over our yard. 2 officers walked the perimeter of the house, checking the windows and doors, while another took my statement. "Did you get a good look at the person?" the officer asked, jotting down notes in his notepad. I shook my head. No, they were standing in the shadows. I couldn't see their face. The officer nodded, his expression calm but concerned. We'll patrol the area and keep an eye out, but it could be a prank. It happens sometimes in more remote areas like this." "A prank?" Laura repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. "Who would do something like this?" The officer didn't have an answer. After the police left, we tried to go about our evening as normally as possible, but the tension in the house was palpable. We were on edge. I stayed up late that night, sitting by the window, watching the yard, waiting for the figure to return. But the hours passed in silence, and by the time dawn broke, I was left wondering if the worst was still to come. For the next few nights, things were quiet. There were no more tapping sounds, no shadowy figures in the yard. I started to think that maybe the police were right. Maybe it had just been a prank, someone trying to scare us for fun. But then, on the 5th night, it happened. We had all gone to bed. After what had happened, we started taking the children to sleep with us in our room. The house was quiet and still. I was half asleep when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible creak. My eyes flew open, and I sat up in bed, listening. The sound came again. This time it was closer. A faint shuffle, like someone moving carefully through the hallway. My heart dropped. Someone was inside the house. I reached over and shook Laura awake, motioning for her to stay quiet. She sat up, her eyes wide with fear, as I grabbed the flashlight and was about to creep out of the bedroom. That's when I saw him. The figure was standing at the doorway of our bedroom, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. But I could see the gleam of something in his hand. A knife. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The feeling of terror hit me like a punch to the gut, sudden and suffocating, the knife catching the faint glow from the hallway. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Stay quiet," he said, his tone chilling in its calmness. "I won't hurt you. We just want your things." Behind him, I could hear the faint sound of footsteps downstairs, the creak of floorboards, drawers being opened and closed. My stomach turned. There were more of them. "I've got 2 guys downstairs," the intruder continued, his voice steady. "We're going to take what we want and then we'll leave. No one has to get hurt, but you need to stay quiet." My hands clenched around the edge of the bedsheet as I tried to keep my breathing steady. Beside me, Laura was trembling, her wide eyes locked on the man. She didn't move, barely even blinked. For a split second, my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Could I overpower him? Could I grab something, anything, to protect us? But the knife glinted again in the doorway, and that's when it hit me, how powerless I really was. I couldn't save my family. I couldn't stop this from happening. I was at the mercy of this man, of these people who had turned our home into a prison. The realization settled into my bones like ice, the fear no longer just in my head, but in every fiber of my body, paralyzing me with its cold grip. In that moment, I wasn't just scared. I was completely and utterly helpless. And that, more than anything, was the worst part. I nodded, my voice barely a whisper. "Okay, just don't hurt my family." The man's expression didn't change. He stood there, watching us, his eyes cold and empty. The sound of rummaging downstairs grew louder. Voices, footsteps, the sound of things being tossed aside. Every second felt like an eternity. I kept expecting the man to lunge forward to do something unpredictable. But he just stood there, like a predator waiting for his prey to settle. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, until finally the noises downstairs began to fade. A voice called up from below, "We're done." The man at the door gave a small nod, as if signaling to someone only he could see. "Remember," he said, his voice as cold as the knife in his hand, "stay quiet." He backed out of the room, his steps slow and deliberate, never turning his back on us. I could hear him retreating down the stairs, the creak of the floorboards growing fainter with each step. The kids were still sleeping. Laura and I didn't move. We didn't dare. The house was eerily silent except for the faint thuds of the intruders leaving. When the front door finally clicked shut, I let out the breath I didn't know I had been holding. My whole body shook as I scrambled out of bed, rushing to lock the door behind them. Laura collapsed into sobs, and I grabbed her, holding her as tightly as I could. We didn't call the police right away. We were too scared, too shaken to even think clearly. It wasn't until an hour later, when the fear gave way to anger, that I finally picked up the phone. The police arrived within minutes, but it was too late. The intruders were gone. They had taken everything they could: electronics, jewelry, even the kids' piggy banks. But the worst part wasn't what they took. It was the violation, the feeling of being completely powerless in our own home. The police told us the same thing they always say in these situations: change the locks, get security cameras. But none of that really helped. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching. Every creak in the house sent me into a panic. Every night as I lay in bed, I replayed that moment, the figure standing in the doorway, the knife in his hand, and the cold, empty promise that they wouldn't hurt us. But the truth was, they already had. I've always considered myself a good judge of character. My wife, Megan, jokes that I can read people the moment I meet them, and I've prided myself on that skill. We had moved into our new house about a year ago. It felt like the perfect place to raise our son, Connor. It wasn't long before we got to know our neighbors. There was Mrs. Thompson across the street who loved to bring over baked goods, the young couple next door who had just gotten married, and then there was Greg. Greg lived a few houses down, a middle-aged man who lived alone. He was always the first to offer a hand if you needed help. Friendly, unassuming, always with a smile. If you needed a tool, Greg had it. If your car broke down, Greg would be there in minutes to lend a hand. We liked Greg. Everyone did. It wasn't until things started disappearing from our house that I began to see Greg in a different light. It started with small things, items we could easily overlook. A pair of sunglasses, my phone charger, and Megan's hairbrush. Things we chalked up to being misplaced. Nothing more. We had a 3-year-old, after all, and toddlers are notorious for moving things around the house. At first, we thought Connor was playing with our things and leaving them in odd places. But it kept happening. One night, Megan couldn't find her favorite necklace. She swore she had left it on the kitchen counter, but when she went to grab it before dinner, it was gone. We searched the entire house, under the couch, behind the dressers, in the car, nothing. It took a few days for me to start suspecting that something far more unsettling was at play. My wristwatch, a gift Megan had given me on our anniversary, vanished from the bathroom counter. I knew I hadn't moved it, but there it was, gone. I mentioned it to Megan, and she brushed it off, saying it was probably misplaced like the other things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One evening, after putting Connor to bed, I decided to unwind with a glass of wine in the backyard. Megan was out with friends and the house was quiet. It was one of those calm summer nights, the kind where the air is still and the only sounds are the occasional chirps of crickets. I had just settled into my chair when I noticed something. A ladder was propped against the side of the house, leading up to the window of one of the bedrooms. For a moment, I froze, staring at the ladder in disbelief. It hadn't been there earlier. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Had I forgotten we had left it there after cleaning the gutters? No, we hadn't used it in weeks. I slowly stood up, my eyes locked on the window above. Was someone up there? I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone had been watching, waiting for the right moment to climb inside. I moved closer to the house, feeling exposed, as if every step I took was being observed. I looked up again, straining to see if there was any movement in the window. But nothing stirred. The window was closed, the curtains still. With trembling hands, I grabbed the ladder and yanked it down, my heart racing. I stood there for a moment, staring up the window, wondering if whoever had placed it there was still nearby, watching me. When Megan got home an hour later, I told her what I'd found. She tried to laugh it off, suggesting it could have been a neighbor messing around or maybe even kids from down the street. But the uneasy feeling gnawed at me, and deep down, I knew it wasn't a prank. Someone had put that ladder there, and I couldn't shake the thought that whoever it was had been planning to climb in. A few days after the incident in the backyard, Greg showed up at our door with his usual smile. "Need any help with anything?" he asked, glancing around the yard. "I noticed your hedge looks like it could use a trim." I thanked him and told him I'd handle it later, but he insisted. No trouble at all, he said. I've got some time. Besides, I like keeping busy. That was Greg, always willing to help. He spent the afternoon trimming the hedge, chatting with me about mundane things. I was grateful for the help, but something about the way he looked at the house, at the windows, made me uneasy. He had an intensity in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. Later that evening, I mentioned it to Megan, but she dismissed it. Greg's just a nice guy, she said. You're overthinking things. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few weeks passed without any more strange occurrences, and I started to relax. Maybe Megan was right. Maybe I had been overreacting. Life settled back into its routine, and I started to feel comfortable in our home again. Then, there is the night that everything changed. Megan and I were watching TV in the living room when we heard a faint rustling sound coming from upstairs. At first, we thought it was Connor. Maybe he had woken up and was playing in his room. But when we checked the baby monitor, he was sound asleep. The sound continued, a soft, almost deliberate noise, like someone was moving around in the hallway. I grabbed a flashlight and told Megan to stay with Connor while I went to check it out. My heart was pounding as I made my way upstairs, the house eerily quiet except for that faint rustling. I reached the top of the stairs and shone the flashlight down the hallway. And there he was, Greg. He was standing in the doorway of our bedroom, his back to me, rummaging through one of Megan's jewelry boxes. For a moment, I couldn't move, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Greg, our friendly, helpful neighbor, was in our house. He had broken in, and he was stealing from us. The rage hit me all at once. Greg, I shouted, my voice shaking with anger. He froze, turning slowly to face me. For a moment, his face was blank, like he didn't recognize me. Then, a smile, a slow, twisted smile spread across his face. I was just helping, he said, his voice calm, almost casual. You left the door unlocked. I knew that was a lie. We always locked the doors at night. Always. My hands were trembling as I stood there. I couldn't believe this was happening. Greg, the guy who had always been so kind and helpful, was standing in my house, acting like he had every right to be there. What the hell are you doing? I demanded, taking a step forward. Greg didn't move. He just stood there, watching me with that same unsettling smile. I've been helping you, he said softly. You didn't even know, did you? All those times you thought you'd lost something. I was just borrowing it, keeping it safe. My mind raced as his words sank in. Greg had been in our house before, sneaking in when we weren't home, taking things, watching us. He had been manipulating us from the beginning, playing the role of the perfect neighbor while invading our lives. I felt sick. You need to leave, I said, now. For a moment, Greg didn't move. His eyes flicked toward the hallway, then back to me. The tension in the air was suffocating, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Then, without a word, he turned and walked past me, down the stairs and out the front door. I locked it behind him, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the latch to turn. We called the police that night, and they came to take a report. Greg was gone by the time they arrived, and they didn't find any signs of forced entry. He'd been using a spare key, a key we didn't even know was missing. The officers told us we were lucky. It could have been much worse. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about all the times Greg had been inside our home, watching us, taking things, maybe even listening to our conversations. It wasn't just the invasion of our physical space that haunted me. It was the betrayal. We had trusted him, and he had violated that trust in the most personal, horrifying way possible. We never saw Greg again. The police told us he had packed up and moved out of the neighborhood just days after the incident. But I still feel his presence sometimes, like he's still watching us from somewhere. I don't think I'll ever truly feel safe again. When we moved into our new house, everything seemed perfect. It was a cozy 2-story home with a spacious backyard and a finished basement, which we intended to turn into a game room for our kids. The house was in a good, friendly neighborhood, and the price was almost too good to be true. It felt like we had finally found the home where we could settle down and raise our family. At first, everything was great. My wife, Sarah, and I spent our days unpacking and arranging the furniture while our kids, Harper and Max, ran through the house, claiming their new rooms and exploring the backyard. It felt like a fresh start. But then, something changed. Doors that I was sure I had closed would be slightly ajar. The lights in the basement flickered from time to time, even after I changed the bulbs. Sarah chalked it up to the house being old, the wiring probably needed an update, but it didn't sit right with me. Then there were the sounds. At night, as we lay in bed, I would hear faint creaks coming from the basement. It was as if someone was walking around down there, even though we hadn't fully set it up yet. Sarah didn't hear it at first, but as the nights went on, the sounds became more distinct and more unsettling. It was a Saturday afternoon when I decided to tackle the basement. Sarah had taken the kids to a birthday party, so I had the house to myself. I figured I'd set up the game room as a surprise for the kids, maybe get a few hours of peace and quiet while doing it. But as I descended the stairs to the basement, that quiet feeling of unease I'd been ignoring came back, stronger than ever. The air down there was different, stale and heavy, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. The basement was dimly lit with only a few small windows, letting in faint slivers of daylight. I flipped on the overhead light, but it flickered and then went out completely. Great, I muttered under my breath. I grabbed a flashlight from my toolbox and set to work. As I started moving boxes and arranging furniture, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but of course, no one was there. Still, the feeling persisted. I tried to ignore it, focusing on setting up the ping pong table and putting together a shelf for the board games. But every so often, I would hear something, a soft rustling sound like fabric brushing against the floor. I stopped and listened, holding my breath. Nothing. I shook my head, telling myself I was being paranoid. It was just the basement. Dark, old basements always felt creepy, right? But as I resumed my work, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt something, a presence, a cold draft that seemed to move through the room, even though the windows were shut. I didn't stay down there much longer after that. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Sarah noticed it too. She would come into the kitchen in the morning and find the basement door open, even though we were both sure we had closed it the night before. We heard more noises at night, footsteps, whispers, and once, a faint knock coming from the basement door. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Sarah and I were watching TV in the living room when we heard a loud thump coming from the basement. It was so sudden and so loud that we both jumped, our eyes meeting with a shared look of alarm. "I'll go check it out," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way to the basement door. As I reached for the handle, I hesitated. There was something about the basement that felt wrong. Like it wasn't just part of the house, but something separate. Something darker. I shook off the feeling and opened the door. The air was cold, colder than it should have been. I descended the stairs, my flashlight sweeping the room, but everything seemed to be in its place. No boxes had fallen, no furniture was overturned. Nothing was out of the ordinary, except for the fact that the temperature felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. I stood there for a moment, my breath visible in the beam of the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. I went back upstairs, but the sense of dread lingered. It wasn't long before Harper and Max started noticing things too. Harper, our 8-year-old, came to us one night, saying she didn't want to sleep in her room anymore. "Why, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, sitting on the edge of her bed. "There's someone in the basement," Harper whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean, someone in the basement?" "I hear them," Harper said. "At night, they walk around and sometimes they knock on the door." My heart sank. Sarah shot me a look that told me she was just as unsettled as I was. We assured Harper that there was no one in the basement, that it was just the house settling, but she wasn't convinced. And honestly, neither was I. Max, who was only 5, started refusing to go downstairs altogether. He said the basement made him feel cold and that it smelled funny. We tried to reassure him, but the truth was I understood exactly what he meant. There was something in the basement, and it was growing more bold. One night, about a month after we had moved in, things reached a terrifying climax. It was just after midnight when Sarah and I were jolted awake by the sound of something crashing in the basement. This time, it wasn't just a soft thump or a distant knock. It was loud and violent, like something or someone was tearing the place apart. I jumped out of bed, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Sarah was already grabbing her phone to call the police. "I'm going down there," I said, grabbing the baseball bat I kept in the closet. Sarah looked at me with wide eyes, fear etched across her face. "Be careful." I nodded and made my way down the stairs, the bat clenched tightly in my hands. The crashing sounds had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. When I reached the basement door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a brief moment, I considered turning back, but something deep inside urged me to push forward. I opened the door. The basement was pitch black, the overhead light having gone out again. I flicked on my flashlight and descended the stairs. As I reached the bottom step, the flashlight illuminated something that made my heart stop. The furniture had been moved, every piece. The ping pong table was overturned, the shelves knocked down, boxes scattered across the floor. But that wasn't the worst part. As I moved closer to the far corner, a strange sensation prickled the back of my neck, like I was being watched. That's when I saw him. Hunched over, hidden behind an old dresser, a man sat on a pile of dirty blankets, his wild eyes staring back at me. His clothes were filthy, his hair matted, and he reeked of sweat and grime. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Who the hell are you?" I managed to choke out. The man didn't respond. He just stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, like he was daring me to move closer. My mind raced as I tried to process what was happening. How long had he been down here? How had he gotten in without us knowing? "I'm calling the police," I said, taking a shaky step back, gripping my phone with trembling hands. My heart was pounding in my ears as I dialed 911. The man didn't flinch. He just sat there, watching me. As I waited for the call to connect, I took a few more steps back, putting as much distance between us as I could without turning my back to him. "You need to get out," I said, my voice firmer this time, though my heart was still racing. "The police are on their way." For a moment, neither of us moved. The air was thick with tension. Then, without warning, the man darted toward the small basement window. My flashlight flickered as I turned, the beam catching him just as he hoisted himself up and out through the narrow opening, disappearing into the night. I ran up the stairs, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the door. The dispatcher's voice came through the phone, but I could barely hear her over my own heavy breathing. I quickly relayed what had just happened, my words stumbling over themselves as I tried to explain how I'd found a stranger living in our basement. By the time the police arrived, the man was long gone. They searched the basement, shining their own flashlights into every corner, but found nothing that could help identify him, just the old furniture and boxes we hadn't unpacked. "He must have escaped through the window," one of the officers said, shining his light on the small opening in the wall. "It's pretty easy to pry open. You should get that sealed up." I nodded, my mind still reeling. It didn't make sense. How long had he been down there? What had he been doing? I asked the officers if they thought he'd come back, but they were non-committal, responding with nothing more than general answers. "We'll patrol the area for the next few nights, just in case," one of them said before they left. Sarah and I were too shaken to stay in the house after that. We packed up the kids and spent the next few nights at her sister's, unsure of when, or if, we'd feel comfortable going back. When we finally returned, the fear lingered. I sealed the basement window myself, tightening every lock and even installing motion detectors outside. But none of it made me feel safe. I couldn't shake the image of that man sitting in the dark, watching us. I kept replaying the moment over and over in my head, wondering how long he had been down there. What had he seen? What had he been waiting for? And though the police never found him, though they assured me it was probably just a drifter, I couldn't help but feel like it wasn't over. Like somehow he was still out there, waiting for the right moment to come back. Late at night, when the house is quiet, I still catch myself listening for the sound of movement from the basement. And every time I hear a floorboard creak, I wonder if he's already back, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the next time we forget to check. It was a Saturday evening, just like any other. My wife, Jen, was in the kitchen, humming along to the radio as she prepared dinner, while our two kids, Luna and Ethan, played in the living room. I was lounging on the couch, half watching some mindless show on TV, my mind beginning to drift toward the week ahead. It was peaceful, and there was nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that set off any alarms. Looking back now, it's eerie how calm everything seemed, knowing what would happen later that night. Our house sat on the edge of a quiet suburb, backed by woods that stretched for miles. It was the perfect spot, far enough from the city to feel secluded, but close enough for convenience. We had been here for about 3 years, and in all that time, I had never felt unsafe. We were careful, of course. We had a security system, locks on all the doors and windows, and we always made sure everything was secured before heading to bed. But none of that mattered that night. Dinner was a simple affair, spaghetti and meatballs, something the kids loved. We ate together, laughing about something Ethan said, the warmth of the evening wrapping us in a sense of contentment. Afterward, we settled into our usual routine. Jen and I cleaned up, and the kids got ready for bed. It wasn't until I went outside to take the trash out that I noticed something strange. As I stepped onto the back porch, a chill ran down my spine, despite the warm summer air. The woods behind our house were darker than usual. I paused for a moment, squinting into the trees, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my back. That's when I noticed something, a faint rustling sound, just beyond the tree line. It could have been anything, a deer, a stray cat, but there was something about it that made me stop in my tracks. I stood there, listening intently, but the sound disappeared. I shook my head, assuming it wasn't anything worth worrying about. After all, we lived near the woods. Strange noises were normal, right? But as I turned to go back inside, I noticed something just in my peripheral vision. A shadow, barely visible in the fading light, moved between the trees. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, staring into the darkness, trying to figure out what I had just seen. Could have been just a light distortion. I muttered to myself, forcing my legs to move and get back inside. But as I shut the door and locked it behind me, the uneasy feeling lingered. Later that night, after the kids were in bed and the house had settled into its usual quiet, Jen and I curled up on the couch to watch a movie. I had almost forgotten about the strange shadow in the woods when a loud bang echoed from outside. Jen jolted upright, her eyes wide. "What was that?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. I shook my head. "I don't know. Maybe something fell?" But I knew it wasn't that. The sound had been deliberate, like someone had slammed something against the side of the house. I grabbed the flashlight we kept by the door and cautiously stepped outside, Jen following closely behind. The backyard was empty. Nothing seemed out of place, but that feeling, the one that made my skin crawl earlier, was back, stronger this time. I shined the flashlight toward the woods, my breath fogging in the cool night air. There it was again. Movement. But this time, it wasn't a shadow. It was a person. A tall figure stood just beyond the edge of the trees, staring at the house. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, watching us. For a moment, I considered stepping closer, but Jen's hand on my arm stopped me. "Let's go inside," she whispered. We backed into the house, locking the door behind us. I immediately armed the security system, the sound of the beeping alarm giving me a brief sense of control. But deep down, I knew that if whoever was out there wanted to get in, an alarm wouldn't stop them. "Do you think we should call the police?" Jen asked, her voice shaking. I hesitated. What could I tell them? That someone was standing in our yard? That we felt watched? It sounded ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random passerby. They were watching us, waiting. "I don't know," I said finally. "Maybe we should just keep an eye out." The night dragged on. I couldn't sleep. Every gust of wind outside the window felt like a threat, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing there, watching. It was around 3 a.m. when it happened. I had finally dozed off when the sound of shattering glass jolted me awake. My heart leapt into my throat as I sat up in bed, my mind struggling to process what I had heard. The house alarm blared, its shrill wail cutting through the night. Jen was already out of bed, her face pale with fear. "The kids," she gasped, rushing toward their rooms. I followed her. As we reached the hallway, I heard it. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from downstairs. Someone was in the house. My mind raced as I grabbed the baseball bat I kept in the closet, trying to think of a plan. The intruder had broken in through the kitchen window, and from the sound of it, they were making their way toward the stairs. I motioned for Jen to get the kids and lock themselves in the bedroom. She didn't argue. As soon as they were safe, I moved toward the stairs. The intruder's footsteps grew louder, closer. I positioned myself near the top of the stairs, my body trembling with fear and adrenaline. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. And then I saw him. A tall man, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by a mask, stood at the bottom of the stairs looking up at me. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, his presence sending a wave of terror through me. For a moment, we stared at each other in silence, the alarm still blaring in the background. My mind raced. Should I confront him? Run? Call the police? Before I could decide, the man took a step forward. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking. I raised the bat, hoping it would be enough to scare him off. But he didn't stop. He took another step, then another, climbing the stairs with deliberate, measured steps. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped by the terror of the moment. Suddenly, there was a flash of movement behind the intruder, red and blue lights illuminating the darkness. The police had arrived. The man turned, hesitating for a split second before bolting toward the shattered kitchen window. I watched as he disappeared into the night, the sound of sirens growing louder. I collapsed against the wall, my legs shaking with relief and fear. The police searched the area, but they didn't find him. Whoever had broken into our house was gone, leaving nothing but shattered glass and the lingering terror of what could have happened. In the days that followed, we learned that the break-in hadn't been random. The man had been watching us for weeks, studying our routine, learning when we were most vulnerable. He hadn't been after our valuables. He had been after us. The police advised us to stay somewhere else for a while, just in case. We never caught the man who broke in that night. He vanished into the darkness, leaving us to live with the fear that he might return. And every time I hear a noise outside, I wonder, will he come back? If these chilling home invasion stories left you on edge, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new terrifying tale. Stay safe, lock your doors, and remember, sometimes the real horror is closer than you think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.